All right, good afternoon. My name is Mark Erikson, and today I'm excited to talk to you about hooks, HOCs, and trade-offs. Some thoughts and observations on React hooks, Redux, and separation of concerns. This is actually my third time speaking at React Boston. My very first talk was here 2 years ago. I was not scheduled to speak last year, but got to do so anyway. Happily, this year I had more than 2 hours of notice the morning of to prepare my talk. A couple quick things about myself. I will answer questions about React and Redux basically anywhere there is a comment box on the internet. I collect large numbers of links to anything that looks potentially useful. I write exceptionally long blog posts, and I am a Redux maintainer. And if you don't recognize me for any of those things, there's a good chance you know me as that guy with the Simpsons avatar pretty much everywhere. So I want to start with a brief history of some code reuse patterns in React. Once upon a time, there were mixins. And mixins were specifically part of the original create class API. You could write an object that had some partial initial state and some methods, and pass that to create React class. And these pieces of code would be mixed in to the final generated class. And you could have multiple mixins attached. And this was a valid way to share and reuse some pieces of code. And this was really a very common thing in various JS usage in the mid to late 2000s. But ultimately, this approach had a bunch of problems. There were implicit dependencies on the different functions. It might be hard to tell which mixin was providing which bit of code. And there might be name clashes. In this example, we have a mouse position thing. What happens if more than one mixin has a piece of state called X or a function called handle mouse move? And ultimately, this becomes an inheritance question. And we've heard discussions about how multiple inheritance of classes can become a problem, and this is really just another form of that. So by 2015, the React team was telling people that mixins are bad, they're in the API, but please stop using them. Instead, we encourage people to use a pattern called higher order components, or HOCs. And this is really a decoration-based approach. You write a function that accepts a component as an argument and returns a new component that manages some data and then renders your component and passes that data down as props. And the good news is that unlike mixins, which only worked with create React class, HOCs work with ES6 class components, create React class, or function components. And it really encourages a kind of separation between your components that show the data and your components that manage the data. On the other hand, it does add a level of indirection. If you have multiple HOCs, it might be hard to tell which of those is providing a given prop. You can still have name clashes. In this example, what happens if you pass a prop named X to the generated wrapper component? It would actually stomp on the piece of data that it was being stored internally. And it leads to a more nested component tree. How many of you are using Redux and you've looked at the React dev tools and all you see looking down your tree is connect X, X, connect Y, Y, and multiple levels of nesting all the way down? Now the good news is that HOCs don't require anything special. It's really just a principle of functional programming being applied, but they're not perfect. So by mid-2017, folks had been looking at React and realized that they could come up with a new pattern, again, just based naturally on how React works, where you have a component that still manages some data for you, but it doesn't actually do any of the rendering work itself. Instead, you inject some kind of a callback function as a prop. This render props component passes its data to the function and lets that function do the work of rendering based on the parameters. And so the render props pattern became very popular very quickly, popularized by Michael Jackson from React Router. And for a while there, it was like every API needs to have a render props version. And again, the good news is this works with any component type. You can actually use render props to implement HOCs, but not the other way around. And it is a form of runtime composition, so you could be more dynamic putting this together. On the other hand, trying to use multiple render props at once was a pain. I saw a tweet from Andrew Clark of the React team from early 2018 where he said that I'm trying to use some render props and I'm like 10 levels nested deep in one render function. This is impossible. I can't read this. So all of these approaches have their issues. And at ReactConf last fall, the React team introduced a new approach, hooks, where the React now allows function components to store some of their pieces of state and execute side effects. And as part of this, you can extract logic as custom hooks and use kind of a linear data flow approach, where maybe one hook manages some data, you call that first, and then pass the result to another hook to kind of feed that chain. And the good news is these are very easy to compose. You don't have the name clashing issues. It's very easy to extract logic, but they do introduce some new problems. You have to follow the rules of hooks. All the hooks must be at the top level. You can't render them conditionally. And we're now dealing with JavaScript closures, which can be a tricky topic. It only works with function components, and there are a few bits of usage that are a little harder to deal with. So when hooks came out, like 30 seconds after the announcement, there were people who were already claiming hooks-related package names on NPM, creating GitHub repos to serve as lists of hooks, and people were like, I'm never going to write another class again. Why are you still using classes? This is awful. But despite the very enthusiastic reception, there are some various questions I've seen, and we've actually heard a couple of them voiced already today. Things like, how do I test a component that relies on some sort of external data source? And if I'm using hooks and context together, doesn't that mean I'm kind of violating separation of concerns? And I used to be able to separate things out into different methods, and now because my click handlers and stuff have to close over variables, my render function is now this long, and I have to read through a bunch of other functions just to see what's there. And these are all very valid points of concern. I'm not going to exactly try to address them today, but I do have some thoughts and observations based on these questions that I want to try to look at. And we'll specifically look at them through React-Redux, because that's what I'm most familiar with, and that is the source of a lot of these questions. So what is actually new with hooks? In some ways, nothing. We could already write components that had state and could trigger side effects. You could already extract some of that logic into separate functions. So in a sense, the only thing that's different is that now you can do that with function components. On the other hand, we can do that with function components now. Like, this is a big deal. I can write an entire app and never have to write the word class one time. I don't have to use the word this one single time. Hooks do make it easier to co-locate your logic. On the other hand, we have to understand closures, and that can be kind of tricky sometimes. And yes, writing components can be longer because of the need for those closures. So let's think about this notion of separation of concerns. And so my observation would be that hooks deliberately make a different set of trade-offs than higher order components do. The longer I've spent in the industry, the more the word trade-off has become my absolute favorite word. Like, it's all about trade-offs. So higher order components really promote writing some plain components that accept data as props. Now, maybe that component has some logic in it, maybe it's just a render method, but the emphasis is on passing down data as props. And that does make those components probably more reusable. Sometimes you might reuse that component. Other times it might really only be used in one place. But you do have the name clashes, the larger component tree, trying to add static types to something like connect can be rather difficult. And if you have a need to get a ref to your own component, higher order components make that harder to deal with. Hooks definitely shrink the component tree because not only do you not have the wrapper component from HOCs, you may have some logic as hooks that mean you don't even need a component for certain cases. They're definitely a lot easier to statically type, and you can use the data flow approach to compose them together. On the other hand, yes, I would say that hooks do lead you towards a stronger coupling with your dependencies. So while it's not anything like necessarily built into hooks themselves, I would say that using hooks does deliberately lead you away from what we would traditionally think of as separation of concerns for your component, because a component now expects to fetch its data and do the rendering for it. We could write separate components to handle that differently, but you've basically just reinvented HOCs just with hooks inside. So looking at connect specifically, the React-Redux connect function is probably the most famous example of a higher order component. And if you look at our docs, we've always recommended that you should try to keep your own components unaware of Redux. Rather than explicitly calling this.props.dispatch add to do, instead you should have a component that just accepts a callback function as a prop so that it doesn't matter whether it's dispatching a Redux action or running something from the parent, or maybe even it's a mock function that's being injected in a test. And so we've also recommended moving your async logic out of components. A component shouldn't just do data fetching inside and dispatch an action, move that outside the component. And this is really why things like action creators and thunks and the map dispatch argument exist, so that you can dispatch actions without having to reference a function named dispatch at the time you're kicking off the Redux logic. One other point to note about Connect is that it does a lot of automatic optimizations so that if the parent component renders this one and all the props being passed down are the same, most likely your component doesn't need to re-render. One other thing to note here is that Connect is strongly known along with this notion of a container presentational pattern. And Dan Abramov wrote a very famous post about that back in 2015. And the key point is he was trying to describe a pattern he was seeing occur naturally in code bases. But a lot of people in the community have kind of overinterpreted that as this is a rule that we must follow. Do I have to put this file in the components folder or the containers folder? Because if I put it in the wrong folder, the entire project will collapse. And so Dan has really backed off of that, and he's marked that article as being outdated. Like, it's not that the ideas in there are wrong, but people were taking them the wrong way. And so in fact, we're planning to revamp the Redux docs as soon as I have time to get around to it. And one of the things I want to do is rewrite the usage with React tutorial page to drop those terms entirely and just focus on literally these are the APIs that you use. So in June, React-Redux released version 7.1, which includes a new hooks-based API as an alternative to calling Connect. If you haven't tried it out, please do. It's really sweet. And there's two main hooks. UseSelector is kind of like the equivalent of mapState in Connect. You pass in a function that gets the Redux state as an argument, and you extract whatever you want to return. So it's really just kind of formalizing this notion of a selector function that we've talked about in the docs. You could even reuse the map state functions that you've already written for your Connect components if you write them the right way. Now, during the alphas, we had a hook called useActions. And the idea was you would pass in an object full of action creators, like you would with map dispatch, and it would return bound up functions that would dispatch the appropriate action when you call them. And during the alpha, Dan filed an issue where he said, actually, I don't think you should ship that. I think it's an unnecessary abstraction, and I don't think it really suits a hooks environment. So we didn't, and instead we just ship a hook called useDispatch, and literally all it does is give you back the dispatch function from the store. Now, that means we're kind of dropping this idea of a bound action creator, and if your function component needs to dispatch an action, you literally have to grab dispatch and do something with it. So you might have code that imports the add to do action creator, but in a click handler or something calls dispatch add to do. One other interesting point out of this is that it is a lot easier to have some asynchronous logic in a click handler or a use effect and dispatch directly from the component when that's done. Normally, we would have said, don't do that in the component, put it in a thunk, and you still can, but maybe there's not as much need to do it in a separate thunk. You've got access to dispatch here in the component. And the last point is that because there's no wrapper component, when the parent re-renders, your function component will re-render also. And so if you need to optimize that rendering, you're responsible for wrapping your component in React.memo to avoid unnecessary re-renders. So yes, these hooks do couple your component more closely to a Redux store because there needs to be a Redux store in context from the provider to grab the state and dispatch the actions. But this isn't really unique to React-Redux. This is true of any component that is accessing values from React context. There's the expectation that that context exists and some context provider is passing down the data. So overall, I would say this is really about trade-offs. Neither one of the approaches is truly right or wrong. It's a question of what qualities do you want to make use of. If you really, really, really want to separate your concerns, you might want to stick with higher order components in some ways. There's a lot of people who like using Enzyme and doing a shallow render of a presentational component without any data. If you want to stick with that, a higher order component might be appropriate. On the other hand, React testing library strongly encourages this mount the whole thing as if it's in the app behavior, in which case it's really easy to test hooks because the testing library doesn't care whether it's HOCs or hooks. You just render it and let it do its thing. It's going to take us a long time to figure out best practices around this. It took us years to go from here's mix-ins to mix-ins are bad, use HOCs. HOCs are bad, use render props. No, wait, hooks are the new thing. It took us a while to get there. Hooks were announced less than a year ago. They've been in production for only about 6 months, or maybe longer if you were really adventurous during the alpha. It's going to take us a long time to figure out what best practices around hooks really look like. As an example, there's a neat library called React Table from Tanner Lindsley. Version 6 came with a pre-built React grid plus the data management. Version 7 is literally just the hooks. You pass in the data and how you want to sort stuff, and it takes care of figuring out the columns and everything. You do the job of rendering it. So it's an interesting take on some potential hooks-based APIs. The last thought here is that I've observed several times that you could kind of divide React developers into two different groups. Those that are application-centric and those that are component-centric. Component-centric developers would say that my React component tree is the app. and that every individual component ought to be solely responsible for, kicking off a GraphQL query or some AJAX call to fetch its own data. Totally valid point of view. On the other hand, a lot of people say that React is still kind of just the view layer, and my app is really the data management and the fetching and the logic that exists outside those components. I don't have a strong specific point here other than I think there is some measure of tying between the hooks and the HOCs idea and kind of which of these camps you might fall into. So one last point I want to make, totally unrelated to the hooks or HOCs thing. Last year I talked about some stuff that was going on around Redux. We completed the docs revamp. All of our documentation sites are new and shiny and look really pretty. But I talked about this project I'd put together called Redux Starter Kit. And it's meant to be a batteries included set of best practices that are the recommended way to write Redux code. It comes with several functions. You can use it day one in a new project. You can incrementally convert an existing project. The two things you are likely to use the most often, there is a small function called configure store that would replace your existing store setup code, and it automatically adds the Redux Thunk middleware, some mutation checking, and it automatically turns on the Redux DevTools extension with the ability to even see a stack trace for each dispatched action of what line of code dispatched that action in the first place. The other piece that's really cool is called create slice, and it's meant to really simplify individual chunks of Redux logic. You pass in a set of reducer functions as an object. Inside of those reducers, we use a library called immer that lets you write mutating logic that actually modifies, say, state.todos bracket 5.completed equals true. And it automatically does all the immutable updates for you, so you don't have to spread and slice and concat and map by hand. And so this makes it really easy to write Redux code in a single file, especially because it auto-generates action types and action creator functions for you automatically. The library is written in TypeScript, so you can use it in both TypeScript and JavaScript apps. And again, it's useful for all Redux users. A number of folks have commented that Starter Kit makes it sound like it's only good for beginners. No, it's meant for everybody. The package name was available on NPM, so we went with it. So it's currently at version 0.7. I pushed out a set of breaking changes a couple weeks ago. There's one more set of breaking changes I want to make within the next couple weeks, but my goal is to have it up to version 1.0 within the next month or so. Depends on how much free time I have and how long it takes to put it together. So I strongly encourage you to check it out. We will rewrite the docs and describe this as the recommended way to write Redux code. It drastically simplifies things. We've started a couple new projects at work, and I'm finally getting to use this for real, and it is amazing how much nicer it makes everything. So that's all. Thank you very much. If you have questions, please come talk to me later.